This week's Gamer's Guide to Feminism is possibly the one that will touch on the strongest direct impact on the bad blood between gamers and feminism. We're going to look at the life, times, and tactics of Andrea Dworkin, and I'm calling it Dwork Wars. Not nearly long enough ago, in New Jersey, Andrea Dworkin was a poet, writer, and activist. More specifically, she set the template for a specific type of feminist activism that detractors refer to it as professional victimhood. To borrow from Shakespeare, I come to bury Dworkin, not to praise her. To say I'm not a fan of Andrea Dworkin is putting it lightly. As a colleague of mine put it, her work is essentialist pap. Her writing makes questionable, sometimes disturbing assertions, and other statements are provably false. Later in her life, she made serious public allegations without anything to back them up. Some analysts also claim that her religious fervor level anti-porn crusade may have destroyed second wave feminism by turning sisterhood into a series of screaming matches. In a just world, someone like Andrea Dworkin, who proudly admitted to being a propagandist, would be appropriately contextualized. However, her theories and methods have been exceptionally influential when it comes to the criticism of video games. Her name comes up a lot, so I think it's important to try to explain why Dworkin appeals to certain types of feminists, despite being a willing caricature of everything that's wrong with feminism. In fact, the cartoonish elements of Dworkin endeared her to her core base of support in a way similar to the late Rob Ford's or Donald Trump's rabid fans. Some people love an apparently uncompromising freak show that gives them license to spew bile. The story Dworkin tells us that she grew up acutely aware of the Holocaust and Cold War nuclear readiness drills, with a mother who was frequently ill after a childhood case of scarlet fever that damaged her heart. Her father was frequently absent due to working 3 jobs and her mother's stints in the hospital. Dworkin paints her father as a saint, but expresses some pretty serious resentment for her mother. But she also called her mother her first great romance. Oh, it gets creepier. At the age of 9, something bad happened. The most commonly repeated story is that Dworkin was molested in a movie theater by a total stranger. But right from the outset, it's difficult to tell whether Dworkin's version of events is reliable, since, through her own words, there are signs that she was already displaying emotional problems. She claims to have played sex and dominance games as a child. She also claims her mother thought she was a liar because she frequently lied to her mother to hang out with older boys. She says that she was glad therapists didn't exist at that time, and this was before her family moved to a different part of New Jersey, so she was no older than 10. At her new school, she claims that one of the only teachers who wasn't stupid played sex and seduction games with smart little girls. By the 8th grade, an English teacher recognized Dworkin's writing contained disturbing content. Dworkin chalked that up to the teacher being jealous of her writing talent, not a teacher concerned about the emotional well-being of a hypersexualized 8th grader. Dworkin claims that she would have become a rabbi if women at the time had been permitted to. Instead, she developed a love for smut and counterculture literature, including the writing of Charles Baudelaire, Henry Miller, Allen Ginsberg, and Lord Byron. Her love of these authors are especially curious considering the positions Dworkin later took on pornography. There's a big difference between someone consuming porn as an adult and someone claiming a sexualized reality as a child. Fortunately, there is some documentation of the sensational story that put Dworkin on the public's radar. After being arrested at a Vietnam War protest while in college, Dworkin was taken to the Women's House of Detention in Greenwich Village. While in the care of prison doctors, she was subjected to an internal medical exam so rough she bled for days afterwards. Some report that the exam was conducted by 2 male doctors, which will become significant later. Dworkin began a letter-writing campaign about the horrors she experienced, and her story was picked up by papers like the New York Times. There was a government investigation of the prison, and Dworkin provided sensational testimony to the grand jury that made national and international news. Just as prison mistreatment had raised public sympathy for the suffragettes, Dworkin's story touched a nerve, and there was an outcry against the mistreatment of inmates at the prison, despite the grand jury choosing not to indict. The prison was closed down 7 years later. It was Dworkin's first taste of enacting her reality upon the world. But Dworkin's tale of misfortune was far from over. After graduation, she moved to Amsterdam to interview Dutch anarchists of the Provo movement, which engaged in non-violent police provocations. Dworkin married one of the anarchists, and despite the group's focus on non-violence, Dworkin claims that her husband was emotionally and physically abusive for 5 years. Dworkin claims that one of her husband's weapons of abuse was pornography, which was the origin of her hatred of it after devouring smutty books as a teenager. The story goes that after she left the marriage, her husband stalked her and she became homeless. She had to turn to prostitution to survive. This was the origin of her hatred of prostitution, though it could be argued that her primary problem was homelessness. Homelessness doesn't involve sex, though, so it's of secondary importance in Dworkin's sexual hypochondria. At this point, I wondered why Dworkin didn't just call her dear devoted father to get her back home. It appears that Dworkin had pushed her father to choose between her and her mother, and he chose his wife. So Dworkin was estranged from her father while she was in Amsterdam, and this was apparently the one imperfect thing he did in his whole life. Dworkin was eventually taken in by Ricky Abrams, a feminist who introduced Dworkin to feminist works such as Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, Shmulevitz Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, and Robin Morgan's Sisterhood is Powerful. Each of these books provides a different component to Dworkin's later gendered clobber passages. She borrowed Robin Morgan's verbal karate style frequently. Her more bizarre ideas on incest and bestiality and her strong anti-Freudian leanings find roots in the dialectic of sex, and one of Millett's key targets in Sexual Politics was one of the authors that Dworkin found influential, Henry Miller. Miller's writing through Kate Millett's lens was an example of the compliant woman ideal in heterosexual relations. I can only imagine how shattering that was to Dworkin's black and white view of the world. Without the ability to process nuance, the very same books that Dworkin cherished in her youth had become part of her persecution. A lot of Dworkin's work reads like Miller filtered through Millette. The florid, bombastic, self-congratulatory writing style remains the same, but consensual, pleasurable sex is replaced with rape. Dworkin couldn't exact retribution on her husband for what he'd done. She couldn't quite bring herself to be angry at her father, but she could attack the male authors she'd worshipped in her youth. This was the crux, it seemed, of Dworkin Breaking Bad. The result of her time with Ricky Abrams was the book published in 1974 entitled Woman Hating, a Radical Look at Sexuality. In its opening words, woman hating reveals both its powerful anger and the limits of its awareness. Dworkin states that before Millett's Sexual Politics and Morgan's Sisterhood is Powerful, women did not think of themselves as oppressed people. In reality, both these texts were reactions to the oppression Betty Friedan previously documented, which was heavily influenced by the previous writings of Simone de Beauvoir. But facts didn't matter to Dworkin. She wasn't writing scholarship. She was writing revolutionary-style propaganda. In contrast to Betty Friedan's persuasive techniques, Dworkin outright manipulated texts she analyzed to fit a desired outcome. While scholarship is challenging and difficult, propaganda is validating and, to the right audience, fun. Dworkin's evangelical style was a siren song to women looking to put a face and a name to their hurts. She treated being a victim as a revolutionary act. She described domestic battery from the victim's perspective with as much zest and zeal as Miller described consensual sex acts. Dworkin throws so much bravado into her depictions of her abuse that you can't help but feel that something must be wrong. You end up finding her suffering entertaining. Dworkin would then claim that was proof of a patriarchal sex domination system, not a response to her stylistic writing choices. As much as she railed against pornography, her writing is what a smut writer would call dubcon erotica. And that's the appeal. Dworkin redefined revolution into a passive state. You could identify as a revolutionary and do absolutely nothing. You didn't even have to be consistent between your identifiers and your actions. The counterculture became easy and accessible, even if you didn't have a coherent point. Dworkin's writing makes any chance of improvement seem hopeless, which provides a powerful motivation to scream and yell and cry, but set no conditions that indicate that the message is getting results. Dworkin encourages the reader to wallow in misery along with her, and that consciousness is enough. There's no need to burn it all down. It's enough to want to. Follow through is irrelevant. Consistency is irrelevant. For example, Dworkin advocated for androgynous, penetration-free, pansexual sex that transcended gender identifiers. However, she personally identified as a lesbian while being married to a man, who identified as gay and had sex with other men while they were married. To point out that this is synonymously cashing in on LGBTQ cred and benefiting from heteronormative social paradigms is, to her followers, just intolerant thinking. This isn't to say that Dworkin didn't have a single good point. She did point out some legitimate sexism, even if she overshot the mark by a factor of 10. She was pro-trans rights back when that wasn't at all a trendy viewpoint. Unfortunately, a few paragraphs below a legitimately cogent thought on the subject of trans acceptance, she also said that bestiality was okay when non-predatory. Right after that, she said that incest taboos were oppressive. Years later, she sued Hustler magazine for pointing out that she wrote that. She lost, because Hustler's interpretation of her comments were protected by free speech. A broken clock is right twice a day, and accountability is a two-way street. In order to get credit for your contributions, you have to be prepared to accept your mistakes. You can't get credit just for being a contrarian. Dworkin was brilliant about 10% of the time. Unfortunately, the other 90% of what she wrote was angry, contradictory ravings, high on style, low on substance. She'd have been an incredible writer if the majority of what she wrote had maintained any internal consistency beyond, I was raped and I hate porn. There's absolutely no way to hold Dworkin to account for any of her radical viewpoints which believe that all sex involving vaginal penetration dooms women to inferiority because patriarchy. This view is where many people get the idea that she said that all sex was rape. The proof of all this gender craziness is apparently pornography. Porn is the link between Dworkin's theories and their application to video games, because the tactics she used against porn are now being used by others against games. This is gonna get weird. Remember I mentioned Robin Morgan's sisterhood is powerful? Well, one of the things to note about Morgan is that her style in the 1960s and 1970s was influenced by the Beat generation, and she decided that meant her writing would be in a quasi-poetic style designed to beat people in the face with words. Morgan coined the phrase, porn is the theory, rape is the practice. Controversial, yes, but evocative. Dworkin, however, was not content with a concept that might be wrong, but was at least coherent. Dworkin did Morgan one better and said, pornography is the theory, pornography is the practice. It was another example of Dworkin not saying something was rape. Dworkin played fast and loose with a lot of variables to reach that conclusion. To her, anything with any sexual content falls under porn, even when it's really not. Dworkin also blurs the lines between vanilla porn and porn involving BDSM situations, as well as some other stuff that, well, let's just say that most people aren't into the stuff that Dworkin displays as examples of run-of-the-mill pornography. Even when she's dealing with something inherently twisted, like the sadomasochistic French 50 Shades of Grey precursor, The Story of O, Dworkin turns a potentially valid point into blather. She fails to account for the fact that The Story of O was written on a dare to prove that a woman could write something as over the top as the work of the Marquis de Sade. It was deliberately sadistic. Dworkin repeatedly equates pornography with sadism when it's more accurate to say that sadomasochistic pornography is one of many types of pornography. The only thing that Dworkin seems to think has the slightest redemptive quality in pornography is that it demystifies the vagina. And despite agreeing that the criminalization of pornography at the time was homophobic and anti-free speech, as well as highlighting that some porn publications would publish feminist work, she sought to criminalize pornography. Why? Because, to her, porn did not cause harm. Porn was inherently harmful. It objectified women and took away our agency by portraying us as insatiable sex fiends. This misses the point that in porn, everyone, male and female, is an insatiable sex fiend. At the core of Dworkin's anti-porn stance is a sexist assumption about the male's sex drive. Dworkin's approach to porn was to get rid of it instead of improving it, and she had some success that set the template for legal challenges to video games' free speech protections. The origins of this were well-meaning. Linda Borman, better known as the porn star Linda Lovelace, publicly stated that she'd been coerced into making the infamous porn film Deep Throat by her then-husband. A group that included Gloria Steinem, Andrea Dworkin, and feminist lawyer Catherine McKinnon discussed the possibility of using civil rights laws to seek damages from the ex-husband and the producers of the films. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations for that kind of action had passed, and Lovelace and Steinem let the matter drop. Dworkin and McKinnon, however, pursued the idea that civil rights ordinances could be used to restrict the making and distribution of pornography. They were hired by the Minneapolis City Council to draft an amendment that would give women claiming harm from pornography the right to sue producers and distributors for damages, claiming that pornography itself was a civil rights violation against women. The amendment was vetoed twice in Minneapolis, but passed in Indianapolis, Indiana, only to be ruled unconstitutional on First Amendment grounds. Of course, all of this censorship without proof of harm contradicts Dworkin's stated objection to obscenity laws, which is why Dworkin had to claim it wasn't about obscenity, but about harm. To get that harm, she normalized her own unusual experiences of movie theater molestation and abuse by anarchists. Instead of seeing racketeering, trafficking, and coercion in pornography as an aberration, she treated it like the normal state of business. Despite never achieving a lasting victory, her temporary ones have emboldened the morality police ever since. Activists in this tradition attempted to use the exact same tactics against video games, claiming they harmed people by making them sexist and violent. The best known of these activists was Jack Thompson, a now disbarred lawyer who pivoted to suing video game producers and distributors after spending some time hassling rap artists. Thompson filed product liability and wrongful death suits against Sony as well as the developers and publishers of various video games. His favorite target was the Grand Theft Auto series. His formula started as video games with a theory, murder was the practice, but eventually evolved into video games themselves being the practice. He joined the Dwork side. Even though the result was history repeating itself, the First Amendment trumped mental hygiene, the fight cast a chill on the video game industry, which now had no taste for a similar lengthy battle over sexism in games, based on the implication of harmful effects on a gamer's views towards women by critics like Anita Sarkeesian and Jonathan McIntosh. And games have in fact been censored in certain parts of the world without the robust free speech protections of America. The most absurd example of this was a censorship of the alien anal probe scene in South Park: The Stick of Truth. The game was released uncensored in North America, and there were no related acts of non-consensual anal probing. Funny that. It's like people know games aren't real. Despite there being no actual evidence that video games cultivate sexist attitudes, and despite video games being protected as artistic speech, many developers are caving to complaints because they're tired of fighting or because they've been browbeaten into believing that boobs in games make women not want to play them. Even Andrea Dworkin said that one of the benefits of porn is that it demystifies lady parts. So why is female nudity suddenly inherently bad in games? Because a mob says so while they're bombarding you with angry tweets. Take back the night has become cover back up. The central disconnect suffered by Dworkin as an anti-pornography crusader was that she tried to reinvent herself as a defender of women working in porn, when it was the content itself that she attacked again and again in her writing. This is precisely the same paradigm that gamers reject regarding feminist criticism of games. Instead of pointing out which mechanics, plot points, and character concepts are inclusive, and which examples of these elements portray women as inherently lesser, tangible examples that can be judged according to the merits of the argument, armchair feminist game criticism is taking the approach that video games suffer from a pervasive and systemic sickness based on cherry-picked examples. It's joined the Dwork side. Gamers aren't going to trust someone who seems to hate video games any more than the adult industry is going to trust someone who, in her own words, was determined to destroy the porn industry. Again, however, Dworkin was a self-described revolutionary who didn't require a successful revolution. But the appeal of Dworkin goes deeper, into something much more tender. Dworkin, more as a person than a thinker, validated female flaws in a way that no feminist before her had. Being unhealthy, both mentally and physically, isn't, in Dworkin land, a sign you need to take better care of yourself. It's a sign you're rebelling against patriarchal oppression. If you never admit you could have expressed yourself better, that isn't narcissism. It's refusing to compromise. So not only do you not have to put in any work, you never have to admit you were wrong. Everyone who opposed Dworkin was just added to her list of persecutors. Dworkin's form of feminism never requires a woman to overcome trauma. Trauma, instead, becomes an identifying feature that automatically means she's right to oppose anything that triggers her. Dworkin's writing was more ongoing and unsuccessful therapy than solid philosophy. Dworkin died young and even managed to blame her declining health to patriarchy and rape. She blamed the osteoarthritis and blood clots in her legs on a roofie she was given by a hotel worker in Paris before him and another man raped her after delivering room service. Note the two men's scenario. It reflects her account of what happened to her in that prison hospital. Even some of her friends worried that Dworkin had, in fact, had a mental breakdown as opposed to being the victim of another attack. Dworkin herself made it public that doctors tell me there is no medical truth to my notion that the rape caused this sickness, but that didn't stop her from claiming it did with the enthusiasm of a faith healer. She died of myocarditis, or inflammation of the heart wall, at the age of 58. Despite being primarily active during the second wave of feminism, the loud, uncompromising, and inconsistent form of reactionary feminism advocated by Andrea Dworkin has become the commonly accepted caricature of third wave feminism. But what's the truth there? Has feminism itself gone to the Dwork side? I'll look at that in the next episode. Until then, I want to share some signs of hope that video games are coming out of this four legs good, no boobs better. The forces of Dwork eventually lost the pornography war, and feminist pornography has even become a genre. People eventually realize that fiction doesn't actually hurt anyone, and the focus shifts to making sure depictions of sensitive content in art are done thoughtfully and respectfully instead of avoided. The more this trend continues of games not making people insane, the more people will realize that this whole moral panic was silly. Take heart and game on.